Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for being here. We are very fortunate to have this today. Professor Ayhan from Istanbul, BUG University is going to be speaking to us about Islamist and nativist reactionary radicalization in Europe. I'm really looking forward to this talk today. Before the presentation, couple of points of housekeeping for you. Professor will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions. If we can keep microphones mute throughout speaker's presentation, that would be handy. If you want to ask something, please do feel free to use the hand function. Raise your hand, turn your camera on, and turn your microphone on, and ask those questions on screen. Yeah. Otherwise, you are also welcome to ask questions in the chat box, and we will be monitoring that. The seminar is being recorded today, so just be aware of that. If you have any questions or concerns, cameras off is probably the way to go. Okay. Without any further ado, I will hand over to Professor Ayhan. Please take it away.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. I know we have rather limited time for an hour, so I will immediately go through my slides, and then I'll just say a few words about my research, ongoing research, and then basically have a rather fruitful discussion, I hope, regarding the regarding some of the early outcomes of our ongoing research. This is an ERC advanced grant research, which started in the early days of 2019. And we have recently completed the field work in different cities. I will tell you briefly in a while. And this is a 5 years research. And now we are at the period of analyzing the interview transcriptions. And we use in vivo software and also the traditional techniques of discourse analysis, etc. If you just let me start saying a few words about myself, my concern as a scholar, as a social anthropologist or political scientist, or rather social scientist. I've been working on Islam in Europe for the last 30 years at least, and also recently conducted other research projects, in-depth interviews to understand the root causes of right-wing populism among the native populations in Europe. And this research is specifically about the young people with Muslim background in Europe and young people with native background in Europe. So far, these youth groups have been studied in different boxes because of the culturalist civilizational paradigm, at least for the last 30 years. And I have come with a proposal to the ERC executive agency saying that we need to develop a new scientific lens to try to understand both groups using the same methodology, using the same question sets, using the same tools. Because if we just drop for a second this dominant culturalist and civilizational paradigm, which is very prevalent all over the world, at least since the 1990s, the war in the Balkans, and of course the Huntingtonian clash of civilizations paradigm, we will see that these young groups are actually quite similar in terms of their socioeconomic, psychological, and political endeavors. So my main concern here in this research is to challenge the neoliberal forms of governance, which specifically concentrate on, which specifically promote a culturalist paradigm in the world, and argue that instead of this culturalist paradigm, we need to revisit the socioeconomic, ways of understanding, political ways of understanding the young populations, who are actually quite similar in terms of their response to the detrimental effects of globalization, deindustrialization, humiliation, alienation, etc. So this research is a rather interdisciplinary research uh, based on political science, sociology, anthropology, and psychology, particularly. So this was actually the starting point of the research, and then I have argued that at the moment, what is going on is that there is a lack of communication between these groups residing in Europe. Both are predominantly European citizens, but unfortunately, because of this culturalist and civilizational paradigm, making the cultural, religious, nationalist projections more prevalent, these groups of young people do not really communicate with each other. Instead, what they do is to become either Islamophobist in the case of the native young populations, at least some of them, and the others are becoming more and more Islamist. So there is a kind of co-radicalization of these two groups of people. Uh, because of the lack of time, I'm not going to go into the research group, but you should know that there is quite a number of people involved in this project, quite a number of advisors from European countries, and a large research team composed of PhDs, postdocs, doing research, doing field research under my supervision, and also ethics board members and administrative team members. So in the research, we have picked up 4 countries: Germany, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. These are the countries with which I'm very familiar for the last 30 years. I've been conducting research, field research in these countries for the next 3 decades, so to speak. And we have designed a survey to conduct interviews in these 4 countries in different cities, trying to reach the number of 320 max. But we ended up with 310 interviews. We have almost reached the target, but this was because of the, of course, pandemic, the limitations of the pandemic. We have specified the cities in the following order. We know that Islamophobia is rather more prevalent in the remote cities, in those rural spaces, working class spaces, where there are actually not really so many Muslims in everyday life. So we have conducted interviews with the youngsters aging between 18 and 30 in cities like Aalst, Ghent in Belgium, Lyon in France, Dresden in Germany, Rotterdam, and the Bible Belt cities in the Netherlands. On the contrary, we conducted interviews with self-identified Muslim youngsters living in capital cities such as Brussels, Paris, Berlin, as well as Cologne and Amsterdam. When I talk about the self-identified Muslims, let me also clearly indicate that we have looked at both Moroccan origin and Turkish origin youngsters with European citizenship, because we also wanted to see the diversification of self-identified Muslims originating from different countries. So if you pay attention to my wording, let me clearly say that we had some issues with these labels, such as right-wing extremists, populists, radicals on the one hand, and Muslims on the other hand. So this is why, while we were trying to reach our interlocutors, we have reached them by saying that we wanted to conduct interviews with those self-identified native youngsters who are labeled as right-wing extremists, or we have try to reach those self-identified Muslim youngsters, because I think that there is a really big problem with these labels, such as Muslims putting everyone into the same basket, basically, and right-wing extremists putting again everyone into the same basket. So instead of using these labels, we try to understand how the self-identified Muslim youngsters and self-identified native youngsters labeled as far-right extremists identify themselves. So this was the number of interviews in different countries, in different cities. We have reached a rather equal number of self-identified Muslim youngsters, female or male, but we had difficulties, of course, in reaching out equal number of male and female native youngsters labeled as far-right, because far-right phenomena, in brackets, of course, is rather prevalent among male populations, so to speak. So let me just say a few words about our findings so far, and try to get your feedback on this as well. Let me just first say a few words about the words that we are using at the moment in Europe, so to speak, about the terms radicalism, extremism, terrorism, and all the other words that we are constantly using. And many of these words are being interchangeably used, not only in everyday life by ordinary people, private individuals, but also by politicians, by media specialists, as well as by scholars, unfortunately. Because we all know that there is quite a fashion to equally use extremism, radicalism, terrorism, fundamentalism, etc., etc. But in 1970s, for instance, when you look at the European community circles, I argue that, one could easily trace this fact. For instance, Trevi Group, which was established back in 1970s to analyze, to study terrorism, radicalism, extremism, and international violence. This group, for instance, was using these terms differently from each other, not interchangeably. So in 1970s, when the neoliberal forms of understanding, neoliberal forms of governance, culturalist and civilizational rhetoric was not that prevalent, we had a better sense of social, economic, and political phenomena in everyday life. And all these terms were used differently because they had all different meanings. But today, unfortunately, those terms are being used rather interchangeably. But there is still hope. When you look at the Radicalization Awareness Network recently, there is a very growing tendency to try to understand the root causes of terrorism, radicalism, extremism, violence, trying to understand psychological, socioeconomic, political, spatial causes of all these different kinds of phenomena. So in that sense, there is still hope that there is a growing literature at the moment which tries to separate these words from each other. In our work, we have been using the term radicalism and radicalization in relation to social movements theory, and especially in relation to the ways in which Craig Collin back in 2011 analyzed the term, I think rather very successfully. Craig Collin separates, or Craig Calhoun classifies radicalism into three from a historical perspective, saying that there is philosophical radicalism, there is tactical radicalism, and there is reactionary radicalism. We don't need to go into detail, but there were radicals of their ages. Democrats in the 19th century were radicals. Descartes in his century was definitely a radical. Martin Luther, as a reformist, as a Protestant, was a radical. Karl Marx, of course, was radical. These are all philosophically radical people. And what I'm trying to do here is also, I think, rather radical. So there's nothing wrong with the term radical. This is one of the things that we are trying to challenge, because we argue that neoliberal governance, again, is kind of bashing the term radicalism in order to prevent any kind of oppositional, any kind of critical move against its hegemony, against the neoliberal hegemony. And this is why we are, in a way, instructed by this neoliberal forms of governance to interchangeably use terrorism with radicalism or fundamentalism or extremism, etc. There is another term that Calhoun uses, tactical radicalism. This is a bit more with violence. Revolutions were radical, tactically radical, because they included some violent elements. Post-colonial movement of the 1960s, youth movement of 1968, and yellow jackets of the present time are, in this sense, tactically radical movements. The third one, which is more actually convenient for me to use in my own research, that is reactionary radicalism. And this is a kind of struggle, Calhoun says, which is posed by different groups of people against the perils of modernization and globalization, trying to find refuge in religion, culture, ethnicity, authenticity, heritage, and myths. So today's ethno-nationalist movements, nativist movements, conservatism, right-wing populism, and Islamism can be considered in this sense as reactionary forms of radicalism. This is why my title today is Nativist and Islamist Reactionary Forms of Radicalism in Europe. And of course, these groups, they are, although they are socioeconomically similar, politically excluded, at least that's what they feel. They are spatially, differentiated and segregated from each other, both having a kind of nostalgic deprivation about the past. They are both using different cultural repertoires, as Charles Tilly would put it, in order to express themselves. So what we found out in our interviews, some of them I'll give you some clues about, the self-identified Muslim youngsters rather use more religious tools, picking up from their own cultural repertoire, while the nativist youngsters are using more nationalist, ethno-nationalist, culturalist, and civilizational tools, which they pick up their own ready-made cultural repertoires, which of course change in time. So when you look at these groups together using the same socioeconomic, political, and psychological lens, you see that both groups of youngsters are going through different feelings of economic, political, and social deprivation that are relative rather than absolute in many cases. And they also have a discontent with politics and societal life. Discontent is here perhaps the most crowded code we have detected in our analysis, in vivo analysis. Both sample types are there expressing discontent with chronic capitalism, corruption, elite people, cleavages, etc., etc. And again, we have detected in the analysis of interviews of both groups certain forms of grievances of those who feel deprived and legitimized through collective action. So these grievances are being legitimized through the use of collective actions, be it nativist, ethno-nationalist, or Islamist. Both groups are certainly in search of a community of certain community of sentiments, using a rather Weberian terminology here, or a term that I picked up from Arjun Apadrai. So I treat the current forms of populism as a form of search for community of sentiments, or self-identified Muslims becoming more engaged in going to the mosques, or more engaged in Quranic texts, etc., also searching for their own communities of sentiments. And of course, both groups create their own scapegoats to put the blame on. Muslim origin migrants always pick up the racist and ethno-nationalist groups. On the other hand, the native youngsters put the blame on the Muslims in many different cases. So here there are some more details about the ways in which the native populations, right-wing native populations, young groups express their deprivation. They are becoming more and more Islamophobist. I use the term Islamophobism because I think Islamophobism is a kind of form of governmentality, or even a kind of thin-centered ideology, like populism itself, being used by these young people, and also being promoted by organized right-wing populist parties across Europe. And there is this very strong discourse among the deprived, socioeconomically deprived young people as being left behind. This is something that we know from the literature as well. And we quite often heard a lot of self-identified native youngsters talking about discrimination in everyday life. And of course, a very popular discourse recently is also detectable and very prevalent in their answers, like Muslim invasion of Europe. And we also know that there is a word for this in the French context, as well as in the other contexts, great replacement theory, which has become a very strong conspiracy recently in France, as well as in the other countries. And of course, these socioeconomic and special forms of deprivation is very much exploited by organized right-wing populist parties using very strong civilizational discourse. Apart from socioeconomic deprivation, relative or real, doesn't matter, or spatial deprivation because they live in geographically remote places, or politically, ideologically remote places, I call spatial deprivation. They also go through a very strong nostalgic deprivation, because they know that globalization is kind of causing to a perceived loss of national glory, and it creates a greater nostalgia. This is something what we call in Saxony, in German case, nostalgia, a nostalgia for the East Germany, a nostalgia for the communist Germany, a nostalgia for the Prussian legacy of the 19th century, etc., etc. And this is also a fertile land for the right-wing populist party leaders, such as Le Pen or the others, to use to revitalize certain myths in order to win the hearts and minds of these people. That is why we have seen the use of myths and heritage in the hands of the right-wing populist party leaders, revitalizing the myth of Jeanne d'Arc, or Roman history, Hellenic past, or Ottoman past, this is actually a quite interesting phenomena that we have seen recently in understanding the right-wing populism, a point that I will also come back very shortly. When you look at the right-wing when you look at the self-identified Muslim young populations, uh, let me just go through a few points which we have observed in analyzing those interviews. But let me just first remind you the literature that I use to explain their forms of radicalization. Michel de Certeau, of course, is very pivotal here because he is the one telling us that Islam has become prevalent over the last few decades because of the absence of left-wing counter-hegemonic global ideologies such as socialism and communism. So, according to Michel de Certeau or even Zizek, Islam is filling that gap that is left absent with the lack of left-wing ideologies. And there is really an interesting parallel between left-wing ideologies and Islam because both promise to their adherents, to their followers, that there is another world possible out there. But of course, with a big difference. The left-wing ideologies promise a world that is not yet there to be lived, but it is something in the future. But Islam promises another world to its adherents, a world that was already experienced back in the past, because they believe that the best world was the world of Muhammad, the true, Muslim. Alistair McIntyre is another sociologist that I often, refer to in order to explain how these dissident groups are expressing themselves using some different, cultural repertoire, religion, or ethnicity, or sometimes culture, myths, etc. This is a way of producing alternative forms of politics, and even violence becomes an alternative forms of politics. And in my own writings, I also use Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy in order to understand the radicalization of young Muslims nowadays in Europe. But of course, these are two very different scholars. Gilles Kepel mostly talks about the socioeconomic root causes of radicalization of Islam, but Olivier Roy is approaching the same question from a different perspective, and he is arguing that it is not actually Islam becoming radicalized, but it is actually radicalism becoming Islamized. So in that sense, I think both are, quite actually helpful to us to understand what is going on. But I rather find Olivier Roy's understanding of Islamization of radicalism combined with what Michel de Certeau was told us earlier. So now coming towards the end of my presentation, to economically use the remaining time, let me just say a few words about these groups, trying to compare them in a way, and trying to show the similarities, because we are often imposed somehow to show the differences all the time. But I think we are at the verge of needing a rather more postmodern discourse in order to understand the similarities between people, between actors, individual actors, etc. So in this sense, we see in this research that both groups actually, have become quite politicized, trying to express themselves against the different perils of globalization. Particularly, these are the daughters and sons of previously working class people or rural people who lately believe that they are being neglected, they are being forgotten, they are being discriminated by those cosmopolitan, globalist, capitalist, transnationalist political actors active in the centers, Berlin, Brussels, Paris, etc. So there is definitely a kind of resentment against this cosmopolitan, globalist, internationalist, or transnational discourse, something that we have also detected, of course, during the Brexit discussions, something that you're very familiar with, I believe. On the other hand, one is becoming more and more Islamist, and the other one is becoming more and more nationalist in order to express their discontent against perceived injustice, inequality, discrimination, and racism. So definitely, in that sense, they are also quite similar. They are also quite similar in terms of search for their own communities in order to express themselves against alienation, discrimination, and humiliation. Humiliation maybe is a word that we need to stick to very much because in many interviews we have detected that both self-identified Muslims and the right-wing nativist youngsters are feeling humiliated by the center, by the mainstream political discourse in the center. So, this is also interesting to see that both groups of youngsters are becoming more and more engaged in heritage and past narratives. And we also know from the literature that these myths are becoming so prevalent everywhere in everyday life. And there is a huge literature going back to Roland Barthes or Eliade or Friedman or Daniel Bell, because myths serve to flatten the complexity, the nuance. It presents a simplistic and often univocal story for those youngsters who need easy answers to these complicated problems of the contemporary world. If you like, I'll just use the last few minutes with some testimonies from the field to give you some clue about their discourses. For instance, we have seen young self-identified Muslims are becoming more religious. When you follow their rhetoric, they explain that they become religious in order to be a good person, to be a good role model for the others. So being a Muslim does not necessarily mean that they are losing their civic German elements, civic Dutch elements, or European elements. So in all these interviews, we have clearly seen, and that is what we are trying to also demonstrate in our publications, which you could see in our website, open sources. We see that we demonstrate that there is no contradiction between being a Muslim and being civically German or civically French at the same time. So this is one thing to underline. On the other hand, if you look at the Moroccan origin and the Turkish origin youngsters, you see a very clear indication that diaspora politics of their countries of origin are very decisive in channeling these religious understandings among their own diaspora communities. For instance, the Turkish diaspora politics under the Justice and Development Party rule under Erdogan's regime is promoting this rather more Sunni version of Islam, while the Moroccan diaspora politics is promoting a rather more Sufi version of Islam among their adherents, their followers. This is a rather really interesting phenomena because we are writing on this as well. There is a huge competition on Islam among different actors. Not only the migrants sending countries like Morocco and Turkey claiming their own official versions of Islam being prevalent in diaspora in Europe, but also, of course, there is Saudi Arabia, there is Qatar, there is Iran promoting different kinds of Islam. And for the last 3 decades, unfortunately, the European states are also claiming to constitute their own versions of Islam: German Islam, French Islam, Belgian Islam, or Dutch Islam, if you want to call it. So we need to do more research on the competition over Islam in Europe, which is a really, I think, important phenomena. And of course, there is no need to go into detail, but these are the youngsters who create their own interpretation of Quran because they are educated in European universities, European schools, and they have access to translation of Quran in their own languages. So they don't need really imams or their parents to interpret Islam for them. On the contrary, they make their own interpretation, and spirituality is very dominant in their discourse as well. When you look at the right-wing nativist youngsters, they are all, of course, very local. I mean, all kinds of radicalisms, extremisms are local. So this is why in our own presentations, we try to argue that we look at, let's say, right-wing populism in Dresden, because it is very different from right-wing populism in another city of West Germany, for instance, because there are all these unresolved historical issues dating back to the communist era, dating back to the reunification of two Germanys, etc., etc. And we have seen in many interviews that there is still a very strong resentment against the West Germany because among these youngsters, West Germany is a kind of colonial power undermining the East German or Saxonian tradition, culture, codes and norms. And of course, they still argue that all those promises were in vain, and there is still a West and East Germany separated from each other. So in this sense, I think we need to have this local perspective to understand the root causes of right-wing populism in different European cities. There is a very clear north and south divide in the discourse of these youngsters in Dresden because they think that West Germany is too kind of brave and open to help, let's say, the other countries in the southern Europe. But there is a kind of discrimination here. They feel that they are being discriminated by Berlin government. This France is lagging behind is a very common trope that we have observed among the right-wing nativists, youngsters in France, and also very strong trope like lagging behind Germany, dominant among the right-wing natives in Lyon. We have interviewed. In the Netherlands is a totally different phenomena. We have seen many interviews in the Bible Belt of the Netherlands near the German border and also near Rotterdam, that there is a very strong quest of protecting the culture and religion as opposed to the globalization fragmenting their own life, everyday life. So this was something that we have observed in the interviews. So the bottom line of the story is that there is a growing culturalized Christianity among the European citizens across Europe. And of course, we know that the churchgoers, the number of churchgoers is decreasing, but Europe is becoming more culturally Christian, even among the atheists and agnostics and seculars and laicists, because of growing anti-Muslim racism, because of Islamophobism, because of this civilizational rhetoric. And this is something that we see very clearly in the writings of Roger Brubaker. So as a summary, we argue that the fight is not between the crescent and the cross. The fight is rather more socioeconomic and political. And both groups are very much disturbed by the detrimental effects, destabilizing effects of global financial crisis and also refugee crisis. And recently, COVID has become very prevalent. And both groups are very much disturbed by the ways in which the mainstream political parties do politics. So there's a very clear depiction of the critique of this mainstream political parties. And this research also shows that we are still living in the same political climate, which could be traced back to the 1990s, the war in the Balkans, where civilizational rhetoric started to become very prevalent. And we see that such forms of radicalization can be perceived as struggles for democracy rather than threats to democracy. This is something that I need to underline because in the social movements theory, this is something that we try to promote or underline very much. Now, I think this is the time to frame issues in socioeconomic, political, and psychological terms rather than cultural and civilizational terms. As I told you earlier, I mean, all these things are already available in the website of our project and also in our social media accounts. I think I'm okay with time. I've just exceeded like 5 minutes. I'm really happy for your patience, and now I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ayhan Kaya. And now we open the floor for questions. We have several hands up. Let's go to Afzal first, and then we go to Marco. Yes, please.
Ayhan, thank you so much. It was a very fascinating talk, and I really am interested in the research you've done. I've got a couple of questions which are distinct but interconnected. First of all, this radicalization issue is very much prompted by international politics. So how do you take account of that when you are looking at it in the sense of communities that are embedded within a national structure? And a lot of what you talked about is economics and a political impact on them within that national structure, as opposed to the international, the global issues that they are riling against, that they're radicalized against. Your point about looking at this in an economic and social sense brings me to my second question, and that is that this question, of course, as I'm sure you're well aware, probably better aware than me, has been addressed, decades ago when I started looking at this issue over 2 decades ago. It was one of the first questions that came up, and the question was answered by another question. Well, if economic and social factors push these people into radicalization, why is it that it happens in these so-called Muslim communities as opposed to in other countries such as Africa, where there is greater degree of social and economic deprivation? So how would you answer that I know these two questions are linked. Thank you.
Yeah.
I am sorry to interrupt
you,
because I'm conscious of the time, and I might ask the question, but I might leave and not. I will. Do you mind if I ask the question as well?
Sure,
please.
Off. Yeah, please.
So obviously, thank you. It's very rich research. The first question, which goes to my actual question, will be what can be done. So I wonder whether within your research we come up with some policy recommendation that you think can address the problem. And in relation to that, this is actually the question I would be interested to know, is it seems to me that you focus substantially to the socioeconomic factors. And the socioeconomic factors, I wonder whether in a sense can be a sort of necessary condition to radicalize people along the reactionary lines that you mentioned. But I wonder whether the actual sufficient, is the necessary, but it's not sufficient in the sense that I wonder which role the personal dimension of the individuals actually play. And I'm conscious that it's quite difficult to capture those. But I'm sure they are related, the social and the personal. But oftentimes, reading some of the reports why some people decide to take, for instance, guns and go and shooting, there is so much of those personal trajectories in life, maybe humiliation they suffer, a broken family. So those very, not so much socioeconomic, but very individualized, and I'm conscious that you can't do much with that when you come with some policy recommendation about addressing what, at the end of the day, they are socioeconomic issues. So apologies, a couple of minutes I can stay, but then I need to shut off. Thank you. Apologies, Afzal, if I interrupt you for answer the question. Thank you.
So thank you, Marco. Then let me just first try to answer your question, your intervention, and then go back to Afzal. They're actually quite interrelated. What can be done, Marco? This is also something that I'm asking myself because we're all doing European Union research projects, and one of the things that is always very important is to offer some policy recommendations. And I think, I mean, I've been working on these issues for the last 3 decades, and I know, let's say, 3 decades ago, there were better opportunities for such different young groups of people to get together and to communicate with each other in one way or another. You know, there were different popular culture tools. For instance, my PhD was on the hip hop youth, rap, graffiti, and breakdance and all that. In those years, back in the late 1990s, both native young groups and the, let's say, self-identified Muslims were coming together to compete on the dance stage with their teas, with their rap songs, etc., in a way aestheticizing this, violence, this conflict, this competition in a way. But unfortunately, for the last 2 decades at least, there is too much focus on religion. There is too much focus on, civilization. And we know that civilization is actually much more than what religion refers to. We know that, 19th century, 20th century sociological, anthropological research on civilization tells us that civilization is far big than only what religion refers to. If you just follow Huntington, he claims that civilization is nothing but religion in a way. So we need to we need to create third spaces, avenues in which these young people could get together with a kind of mediation to talk to each other. So this is immediately the thing that comes into my mind. So it's also what Afzal actually said. I mean, some of the things that I talk are totally not new. I know that, they are not new. For instance, if, we had all these issues back in the 1960s, for instance, I would argue that these young groups of people who are coming from different cultural, religious origins, etc., would set up an alliance, political and societal alliance, to fight back against the central state they are critical of. But nowadays they cannot do that simply because of this, civilizational rhetoric, prevalence of civilizational rhetoric, which divides them into cultural, national, religious blocks. So this is why, I mean, when I say that, I argue that from a very Gramscian perspective, they are not actually very different socioeconomically. So this is why my emphasis on the socioeconomic, political, and psychological elements is very decisive for us to try to find some answers to this ongoing question. The other thing, Marco, you asked, that is right. I mean, radicalism is a rather, popular phenomena. I mean, we are all from time to time very radical, right? I mean, I find myself very radical in many cases because I don't really like all this neoliberal forms of governmentalities, etc., etc. But there are only a handful of people who are becoming extremists, projecting the world from a rather binary Cartesian, Manichaean perspective. And among this handful of people, there are only a couple of people, let's say, I'm just putting it very bluntly, who become terrorists, who cause bloodshed, who cause big troubles. So you're right. I mean, this socioeconomic phenomena is not, of course, enough to explain the root causes of radicalization among these people. So that's why I say locality is very important. Looking at cities, looking at neighborhoods are, I think, more helpful for us to understand what is going on. But I can tell you some of the interesting common phenomena among the personal family histories of the right-wing nativist youngsters. A predominant majority of those youngsters we interviewed had, for instance, family troubles, divorced parents, separated parents, humiliation in everyday life back in the childhood years. So definitely, personal memories, personal histories count a lot. And we will actually upload all the transcriptions online. Anyone wondering about these interviews can have access to it without any trouble. So I think these are the things that I
Sorry, I really need to shoot because my students are waiting. Thank you, Ayhan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Afzal, what I read from your question is that, yes, all these things are happening, as I try to explain, in an international political climate. That is why, for instance, I mean, I've written on that extensively. Personally, I'm very much interested in the rise of, let's say, Islamophobic discourse in Europe. And when I follow the traces of Islamophobic discourse, I go back in modern times. Of course, I'm not talking about history. I'm not talking about 16th century, 17th century, etc. But in modern times, I go back to 1970s when the oil crisis, Arab-Israel war, causing a lot of trouble in the perception of Islam among the European states, European individuals, etc. I also see the traces of the fact that Soviet republics, the left-wing ideologies, communism, were becoming rather more moderate in the eyes of the European citizens. And after especially 1973 Arab-Israel war and 1974 oil crisis, what I see is that geographical other of Europe changes drastically. Instead of the USSR, geographical other of Europe becomes the Middle East, which is the source of all the evils. And on the other hand, the ideological other of Europe becomes rather Islam rather than communism. So in my own writings, I always try to contextualize all these personal histories, all these anthropological observations in this given changing international context. So I'm there with you because, again, following the footsteps of Michel de Certeau, we also see that, especially in 1990s, when the war in the Gulf started, Islam has been, very much misrepresented in the media, in the European media. I remember those moments when the pictures of those Muslim soldiers in the American or British jails in the Middle East becoming public, and how they were tortured, how they were mistreated, and how they were actually how they became extremists in those prisons. I mean, the leader of ISIS, became a terrorist in one of those cells. So this is why the growing global injustice is something that many Muslims see, and we also try to explain all these homegrown terrorists using this international relations, the perspective. So that is why you're absolutely right. And I think I answered your second question. I'm claiming that 1960s paradigms were much more fruitful for us to understand the contemporary world, rather than this unfortunate culturalist and civilizational rhetoric, which make us all concentrate on cultural, religious, ethnic differences. We're all, in the end, human beings with certain, similarities. I'm not talking about sameness. So that is why I think this is a radical position to try to go back to the priority of social, economic, and political parameters in my own research, Afsam. I don't know if I could answer your question. Thank you.
I think you did a great job, Ayhan. I really appreciate that. For what it's worth, I think you've articulated your presentation and your answer in a very appropriate way for a wider audience. My issue really was that, having been looking at this for over 2 decades, 90% or more of what you said, I recognize. Mm-hmm. And I think for somebody like me, the boring, if you like, nerds in this business, what I would like to do is to focus on the USP. And I'm sure, and I'm 100% sure that you have a USP in your research. And it's those bits that would help me to separate what you're adding to my understanding. You've already encapsulated a lot of what I know in a fresh way, looking at it philosophically and so on. But I think that would be of most interest. And I look forward to reading your research greatly.
Thank you very much, Afsam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor, are you available to answer more questions? There are 2 questions from our chat.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. There are 2 questions left in our chat box from Professor Sabina. And the first one is, are you looking at the role of media or digital media in the 2 intertwined trends, growing Islamophobia and Islamism you are examining? She says she is working on a project looking at media polarization and illiberalism, which also looks at these trends in relation to immigration, and through that Islamophobia. This is the first question. And she also left the second question. The second question is, while the specific gender composition of groups you are looking at is to be expected, I wonder whether it is worth investigating the role of women in these trends as either silent or passive enablers, or possibly as agents who may be able to limit radicalization. Yeah, this is the second question.
Right. Well, I couldn't really get the second question, but let me say a few words about the use of social media in our, interlocutors' everyday life. there is a clear indication that and proof that the right-wing native, self-identified native youngsters are very much into the use of Facebook. We could see this trend, and we know how Facebook is actually instrumental in disseminating the fake news, etc., etc. So I think there is a very valuable set of data in our interview transcriptions to be used by the researchers to detect the use of the social media by these groups. And our postdocs are actually working on the use of social media by these two different groups. And if you go back, because I couldn't see the question myself, if you can repeat the second question, I'll be very happy.
Yeah, sure, I repeat it. The second question is, well, the specific gender composition of groups you are looking at is to be expected. She says she is wonder whether it is worth investigating the role of women in these trends as either silent or passive enablers, or possibly as agents who may be able to limit radicalization.
So this is about gender question, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, gender is of course one of the indicators that we are trying to follow. As I said, I mean, you know, we have also written some bits and pieces on reaching out the males and females in two different groups. It was easy for us to reach the young self-identified Muslim men and women, but it has always been very difficult, although we had native researchers on the field, etc. It has always been very difficult to reach out the native populations. Mostly we reached out male populations. And gender is one of those elements that we are also trying to understand. And of course, masculine discourse is very much dominant among the native young populations. They are also quite actually conservative in their gender roles. This is something that we stereotypically want to see among the Muslims mostly. But one of the things that we detect, for instance, is young native women. You know, there were quite a number of interviews as such, demonstrating that they want to accept traditional family roles, to stay at home, not to be professional, not to be working, to look after the kids, etc., etc. But this is a really interesting phenomena, and we found that this is also something similar to the self-identified young Muslim women, you know, let's say talking about their use of headscarf, and the dominant interpretation is that this is a patriarchal pressure coming from the family, coming from the society. But we have tried to claim that references to this traditional, let's say, dressing code or traditional family structure could also be interpreted as a way of emancipation, by which the women can actually recreate themselves away from the traditional interpretations. So rather than simply putting them into the basket of being conservative among Muslims or among native women, we see that this is a way of actually explaining themselves against this patriarchal social structure. And as I said, all the interviews transcriptions will be open to researchers in the European University Institute's library starting from next year on, and everyone can have access to those interviews. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yeah, thank you so much sharing so much insights, and thank you so much for your time to stay here with us more than an hour. I think this is a very productive seminar today. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you for being here. If there is no further questions, we're gonna to close this seminar now. Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.